A poor woman is left for dead after losing her sight in a mountain blast. Snow falls over her body as the last wagon rolls away. No one looks back. But deep in those frozen hills, a lone mountain man hears her cry through the wind. He's not known for mercy. Folks say he buried his heart years ago. When he carries her to his cabin, everyone expects she'll die before morning. But she doesn't. She prays. And that prayer wakes something in him, something he thought was gone forever. Soon the whole town's whispering, why did a blind woman survive when others didn't? And what secret ties her to the land the railroad's ready to steal? As the storm closes in and buried sins rise with it. Can a woman who lost her sight teach a broken man and an entire town to finally see? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The mountain morning dawned crisp and clear as Ayla Hartley made her way down the familiar path to Silver Creek. Her worn boots crunched against the gravel, and she adjusted the heavy basket of miner's laundry against her hip. The weight of the dirty clothes made her arms ache, but she couldn't afford to take smaller loads, not with her mare Sugar sick in the stable and veterinary bills mounting. "Lord," she whispered, her breath visible in the cool air, "please help Sugar get well. She's all I have left since Thomas passed." The prayer came as naturally as breathing while she picked her way between the scrubby pines that lined the creek bank. The water rushed cold and swift over the rocks, fed by melting snow from the San Juan peaks that loomed above. Ayla set down her basket and pulled out her washboard and soap. Her fingers were already red and chapped from yesterday's washing, but she couldn't rest. The miners needed clean clothes, and she needed every penny she could earn. She dipped the first shirt in the creek, the icy water shocking her skin. "At least the cold keeps the swelling down," she murmured, thinking of her aching joints. The rough cotton was stained with coal dust and sweat. She began scrubbing in steady rhythm, letting her mind drift to scripture as she worked. "Consider the lilies of the field," she recited softly. "How they grow. They toil not, neither do they spin." The familiar words brought comfort as she worked her way through the pile of clothes. The sun climbed higher, warming her back as morning stretched toward noon. A distant rumble made her pause, washboard halfway raised. Was that thunder? But the sky had been clear. The rumble grew to a roar that shook the ground beneath her feet. Before she could stand, a tremendous explosion rocked the mountainside. The force threw her backward. Sharp pieces of shale and rock rained down as she instinctively covered her head with her arms. Pain sliced across her face, and she cried out. Through ringing ears, she heard men shouting in panic, their voices thick with terror. "The charges! The second set of charges!" Someone screamed from the direction of the mine. Horror froze Ayla's blood as she recognized what that meant. There was more dynamite yet to blow. She tried to scramble to her feet, but another explosion knocked her down again. The world disappeared in smoke and flying debris. Something struck her head, and darkness swallowed her. When awareness returned, Ayla's first sensation was pain. Sharp, throbbing agony across her face and eyes. The air felt thick and acrid in her throat. She could hear distant shouting and the crackle of flames. "Hello?" she called weakly, then coughed as smoke filled her lungs. "Is anyone there?" She blinked, trying to clear her vision, but the darkness remained absolute. Panic clawed at her chest as she realized she couldn't see anything, not even shadows or light. "Dear God, please," she whispered, touching her face with trembling fingers. Dried blood flaked beneath her touch, and pain shot through her temples. "Please, I can't see." The sounds of chaos from the mining camp grew more distinct. Men shouting orders, horses whinnying in fear, wagon wheels creaking. She had to get to them before they left. She couldn't stay here alone. Ayla rolled onto her hands and knees, ignoring the stabbing pain that radiated through her body. The creek's song guided her as she began crawling through the mud. Every movement was agony, but she forced herself forward. "Help!" she called, her voice raw. "Please, someone help me!" But the wind carried her words away. The sounds from camp grew more frantic. People loading wagons, calling out names, taking count of survivors. She tried to crawl faster, but her arms shook with exhaustion and pain. The sun's warmth on her skin began to fade as afternoon slipped toward evening. The air grew colder, and her wet clothes clung to her shivering body. Still she crawled, calling out whenever she could gather enough breath. A wagon rumbled past in the distance, then another. "Wait," she cried, but her voice was barely a whisper now. "Please wait." The sounds of departure grew fainter until only the creek's rush and the wind's moan remained. Darkness had claimed not just her eyes, but her whole world. Ayla collapsed into the mud, her strength finally spent. "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death," she whispered through cracked lips, "I will fear no evil, for thou art with me." The familiar psalm steadied her racing heart, even as tears tracked down her dirt-streaked face. She couldn't feel her fingers anymore, and violent shivers racked her frame. The mud seemed to be pulling her down, but she no longer had the strength to fight it. All she could do was pray. "The Lord is my shepherd," she continued, each word a struggle. "I shall not want—" The wind keened through the trees like a mourner's cry. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled. Ayla kept whispering, scripture into the gathering night, clinging to faith when all else had been stripped away. "He maketh me to lie down in green pastures." Her voice grew fainter with each word. "He leadeth me beside the still waters." The cold crept deeper into her bones. The pain in her face had faded to a distant throb, but that seemed more frightening than reassuring. She needed to stay awake, needed to keep praying, needed to hold on to hope. "He restoreth my soul." The words slurred as consciousness began to slip away. Still she forced them out, a final declaration of faith in the darkness. "He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake." The last wagon's wheels could no longer be heard in the distance. The camp had emptied, its people fled to safety, leaving behind a blind woman in the mud who they assumed was among the dead. Ayla's world had contracted to pain, cold, and absolute darkness. Yet even as her body failed her, her spirit remained unbroken. Her lips moved in silent prayer as awareness faded. She was alone in the gathering dark, but her faith whispered that she was not abandoned. God was with her still, though all else was lost. The creek continued its eternal song as dusk deepened into night. Somewhere in the darkness, a wounded woman lay in the mud, her prayers a testament to unshakable faith in the face of devastating loss. Her old life as a working widow had indeed ended in an instant, but even in the depths of her suffering, a spark of hope remained. For faith, like light, has a way of piercing even the darkest night. Brooks Pike trudged through the late autumn forest, checking his trap lines with practiced efficiency. The afternoon light filtered through bare branches above, casting long shadows across the trail. His boots crunched on frozen leaves as he moved between the trees, alert to every sound and movement in the wilderness he called home. A strange noise caught his attention, the uneven clip-clop of a horse's hooves somewhere ahead. Brooks stilled, listening. The gait was wrong, limping. He shouldered his rifle and moved forward cautiously, years of mountain living having taught him that anything unusual could spell danger. Through a break in the trees, he spotted a sway-backed mare, her coat dark with sweat despite the cold. She favored her left foreleg, and her sides heaved with exhaustion. No rider was visible, but worn leather reins dragged in the dirt beside her. "Easy there," Brooks murmured, approaching slowly with his hand extended. The horse's eyes rolled, showing white, but she didn't bolt. Up close, he could see she was a working animal, probably from one of the mining camps below. But what was she doing up here alone? He examined her leg. No obvious injury, just strain from whatever journey had brought her this far up the mountain. Following her tracks backward would likely lead to answers. Brooks tied her reins to a sturdy branch, leaving her enough slack to graze, and began backtracking along her trail. The horse's prints led him down a game trail toward the creek. Smoke hung thick in the air, and an acrid scent burned his nostrils. Something had happened at the mines. Something bad. The tracks wandered erratically, telling the story of an exhausted animal barely staying on its feet. He found her first tracks near the creek, where they mixed with human footprints in the mud. Brooks knelt to study the signs, reading the ground like a book. Someone had been here, working by the water's edge. Then chaos, deep gouges in the earth, scattered clothes, signs of falling debris. His eyes followed the trail of disturbed ground, and his breath caught. There, half buried in mud, lay a woman's body. "Dear Lord," he whispered, the prayer coming unbidden to lips that hadn't shaped such words in years. He rushed forward, dropping to his knees beside her still form. She was face down in the muck, one arm stretched out as if reaching for help. Her clothes were soaked through, and her skin felt ice cold when he gently turned her over. Dark hair plastered her face, which was crossed with angry red cuts. Brooks pressed trembling fingers to her neck, searching for a pulse. There, faint but steady. She lived, though barely. How long had she lain here in the cold? "Hold on," he muttered, gathering her limp form in his arms. She weighed almost nothing, like a bird with wet feathers. Her head lolled against his shoulder as he carried her back up the trail to where he'd left his pack mule. Words he hadn't spoken since Sarah died tumbled from his lips as he walked. "Our Father, who art in heaven." The old prayer came back like it had never left, keeping time with his hurried steps. "Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses." The mule nickered softly as Brooks approached. He laid the woman across the animal's back as gently as he could, securing her with rope from his pack. The injured mare would have to follow on her own. He couldn't manage both animals and an unconscious woman. "Come on, girl," he called to the horse, who limped after them as he led the mule up the mountain trail toward his cabin. The sun was setting fast, and he could smell snow in the air. They needed shelter before the storm hit. The woman didn't stir during the hour-long journey, but her breathing remained steady. Brooks kept checking over his shoulder, watching for any change. The cuts on her face worried him. They were deep, and some still oozed blood. What had happened down at the mines? His cabin came into view just as the first snowflakes began to fall. Brooks had built it himself 5 years ago, after Sarah's death drove him from town into the solitude of the high country. It was small but solid, with a stone chimney and tight-chinked logs that kept out the mountain winds. He carried the woman inside, laying her on his narrow bed. In the better light, he could see how pale she was, her lips tinged blue with cold. How needed to warm her up and tend those wounds before infection set in. Brooks stoked up the fire and put water on to boil. While it heated, he gathered his medical supplies: pine tar, clean cloth, whiskey for disinfecting. Sarah had taught him about healing, back when she'd been the town's midwife. The knowledge had served him well in his solitary life, though using it now brought a familiar ache to his chest. Working quickly but carefully, he cleaned each cut on the woman's face. Some were deep enough to leave scars, but none would need stitching. He spread pine tar over the worst ones and covered them with strips of clean cloth. Throughout his ministrations, she didn't stir. The fire had warmed the cabin by the time he finished. Brooks pulled his extra quilt over her and sat back in his chair, watching the steady rise and fall of her chest. Snow fell more heavily outside, coating the window in white. A sudden gasp broke the silence. The woman's hands flew up, clawing at the air as she tried to sit up. Her breathing came in panicked gasps. "Easy now," Brooks said, keeping his voice low and gentle. "You're safe. No one's going to hurt you." She turned her head toward his voice, but her eyes didn't focus on him. They were open, but vacant, staring at nothing. Understanding hit him like a physical blow. She was blind. "Where am I?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Who are you?" "Name's Brooks Pike. Found you down by the creek and brought you to my cabin." He kept his tone steady, non-threatening. "You were near frozen through." Her hands clutched the quilt. "The explosion. The mine." She swallowed hard. "Everyone left. I couldn't see to follow." "I know, but you're safe now." Brooks moved closer, noting how she tracked his movements by sound. "What's your name?" "Ayla. Ayla Hartley." Her fingers touched the bandages on her face. Is it day or night?" The question held such weight, such desperate hope, that Brooks's heart clenched. "Night," he answered softly, "and snow's on its way." He paused, then added, "Can't see anything at all?" She shook her head, tears slipping from beneath her bandages. "Nothing, just darkness." "Here." Brooks ladled hot broth into a cup. "Let's get something warm in you." He guided her hands to the cup, helping her hold it steady. "Careful now, it's hot." Ayla sipped slowly, her hands shaking less with each swallow. Outside, the snow fell thicker, blanketing the world in silence. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls. "Thank you," she whispered when the cup was empty. "For finding me. For bringing me here." Her voice caught. I thought I was going to die out there." "Get some rest," Brooks said gruffly, uncomfortable with gratitude. "You're safe now. That's what matters." She settled back against the pillow, her face turned toward the fire's warmth. Soon her breathing evened out into sleep, but Brooks stayed in his chair, watching over her. Snow continued to fall outside, cutting them off from the world below. In the firelight, he studied her face. Young still, despite the lines of hardship around her mouth. The bandages couldn't hide her gentle features or the peace that seemed to settle over her as she slept. Something stirred in his chest, an emotion he thought he'd buried with Sarah 5 years ago. Brooks pushed the feeling away and fed another log to the fire. The woman, Ayla, needed help, nothing more. He'd get her well enough to travel, then find someone to take her back to town. That was all. But as the fire crackled and snow whispered against the windows, he couldn't help remembering how naturally those long-forgotten prayers had come to his lips when he found her. Perhaps God hadn't finished with him yet, despite his best efforts to hide away from both heaven and earth. Ayla slept on, her breathing steady and strong now. The storm outside grew fiercer, but inside the cabin, warmth and safety reigned. Whatever tomorrow might bring, for tonight at least, 2 lonely souls had found shelter from the cold. Warmth pressed against Ayla's eyelids, a glow she could sense but not see. For one hopeful moment between sleep and waking, She thought perhaps yesterday had been a nightmare. But when she opened her eyes, only darkness greeted her. The crackle of a fire filled the silence, along with a sizzling sound that made her empty stomach growl. The scent of frying bacon drifted through the air, mingled with the musty smell of wet fur and wood smoke. She lay still, orienting herself by sound and smell, building a picture of the cabin in her mind. A floorboard creaked to her left, heavy footsteps, deliberately quiet. Brooks, she remembered, the mountain man who'd found her, who'd saved her life. "You're awake," he said, his deep voice gruff but not unkind. "Thought you might be hungry." Ayla pushed herself to sitting, wincing as the movement pulled at sore muscles. The bed beneath her was narrow but comfortable, piled with warm quilts that smelled of cedar. "What time is it?" "Just past dawn." More footsteps, then the clatter of a plate being set down. "Can you manage, or do you need help?" Pride warred with practicality in her chest. I'm not sure." "Here." The bed dipped as he sat beside her. Calloused fingers guided her hand to a fork. "Plates at 12 o'clock, bacon at 3, biscuit at 9. His voice held no pity, just matter-of-fact instruction. Ayla nodded, grateful for his straightforward approach. She found the bacon with careful touches, managing to get it to her mouth without too much difficulty. The food was simple but good, filling her empty stomach with warmth. While she ate, Brooks moved around the cabin, his footsteps marking a pattern of morning chores. She heard water being poured, wood being stacked, the rustle of heavy fabric. A coat, perhaps. He spoke little, but his presence felt solid, dependable. When she finished eating, Ayla squared, her shoulders. "I need to get to town as soon as the storm passes. The miners will be needing their laundry, and I have wages to collect." The words sounded hollow, even to her own ears. How could she do laundry now? But she couldn't stay here, imposing on a stranger's kindness. Brooks's footsteps paused. "Road's impassable," he said flatly. "Storm dropped 3 feet of snow, more in the drifts. No getting down the mountain for at least a week, maybe 2. The news hit her like a physical blow. 2 weeks? What would she do, trapped here in darkness for so long? Her fingers twisted in the quilt. Surely there must be some way, not unless you're aiming to freeze to death. Something scraped across the floor, a chair being moved. "Best make your peace with staying put for now." Ayla took a deep breath, trying to still her rising panic. Then perhaps you could help me learn the layout of your cabin, so I won't be such a burden?" A long pause followed her request. Then, "Suit yourself. Floor's clear enough. Just mind the fire." Setting her feet on the wooden floor, Ayla stood carefully. Her legs felt weak but held her weight. She stretched out her hands, taking small steps forward. The cabin's air shifted around her as she moved, helping her sense the walls and furniture. She counted steps from the bed to what felt like a table, running her fingers along its rough surface. A cup sat near the edge, ceramic, delicate compared to the cabin's other sturdy furnishings. As she lifted it to examine it more closely, her elbow knocked against something. The cup slipped from her grasp. The crash of breaking pottery shot through the cabin like a gunshot. Absolute silence followed. "I'm so sorry," Ayla whispered into the stillness. She crouched down, fingers searching for the pieces, but Brooks's heavy steps approached before she could find them. "Don't." His voice was tight with controlled emotion. "You'll cut yourself. Please, let me help clean up. I didn't mean to—" "Leave it." He drew a sharp breath, then let it out slowly. When he spoke again, his voice was carefully level. "Keep the other one. You got use for it now." The The words hit Ayla with sudden understanding. The delicate cup. It must have belonged to someone. Someone no longer here. "It was your wife's, wasn't it?" she asked softly. The silence stretched so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "Yes." "I'm sorry," she said again, meaning far more than just the broken cup. Brooks's footsteps moved away, accompanied by the sound of sweeping. "Past's past," he said gruffly. "No changing it now." The rest of the day passed in relative quiet. Brooks went out to tend his animals, his boots crunching in the snow. Ayla explored the cabin more carefully, creating a map in her mind. 12 steps from bed to door, 8 steps to the fireplace, table to the right, chairs around it, a trunk against the wall that smelled of leather and pine. As evening fell, marked by the drop in temperature and Brooks banking the fire. Ayla sat in one of the chairs, cradling the remaining teacup in her hands. Its delicate shape reminded her of better days, of her mother's china brought all the way from Missouri. Without thinking, she began to hum an old hymn her mother had loved. "Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound." The words came softly at first, then with more strength as the familiar melody filled the cabin's silence. Brooks's movements by the fire stopped. She could feel his attention shift, though he said nothing. She continued singing, letting the words of faith and redemption flow into the quiet space between them. "Was blind, but now I see." Her voice caught on that line, but she pushed through, finishing the verse. When the last note faded, the silence felt different, softer somehow, full of unspoken things. Brooks cleared his throat. "Been a while since I heard that one?" "My mother sang it every Sunday," Ayla said, "and any other time she needed reminding of God's presence." The fire popped and crackled as Brooks added another log. "Used to know all the hymns myself back when..." He trailed off, then said more quietly, "Sarah loved that one too." It was the first time he'd spoken his wife's name. Ayla held very still, sensing the weight of this small confidence. "Tell me about her?" she asked gently. The fire snapped in the silence. Just when she thought he wouldn't answer, Brooks spoke, his voice rough with memory. "She was the town midwife. Gentlest hands you ever saw, but strong too. Could quiet a colicky baby or set a broken bone, all with the same steady grace." He paused. "Never heard her complain, even at the end. Just kept humming her hymns, right up until..." His voice faded. Ayla waited, her heart aching for this man's long-carried grief. After a moment, Brooks stood abruptly, his chair scraping back. "Need to check the animals before full dark." The door opened and closed, letting in a blast of cold air. Ayla sat in the firelit quiet, thinking about loss and faith and the mysterious ways God worked to heal broken hearts. The teacup in her hands seemed to hold more than just memories now. It felt like a bridge between past and present, between two wounded souls seeking light in the darkness. Outside, snow continued to fall, but inside the cabin something had shifted. Like the first spring thaw after a long winter, ice was beginning to crack, revealing the possibility of new growth beneath. The days stretched like molasses under the weight of endless snowfall. Inside Brooks Pike's cabin, time marked itself differently, not by sunlight or shadow, but by the rhythm of necessity and small victories. 7 steps to the table, Ayla murmured, her hands outstretched as she walked carefully across the wooden floor. Then 3 more to the stove. Brooks watched from his chair by the fire, pipe unlit in his hands. "Mind that loose board near your right foot." She paused, tapping with her toe, until she found the telltale creak. There it is. A small smile touched her lips. Like a friend now, warning me before I stumble. The cabin had become a map in her mind, each sound and texture a landmark. The rough-hewn wallboards beneath her fingertips, the slight dip in the floorboards near the door from years of boots crossing the threshold. The way sound bounced differently near the window compared to the corners. Brooks found himself speaking more clearly, abandoning his usual grunt and nod way of communication. "Coffee's ready," he'd say, or "Chairs pulled out at 4 o'clock." Simple words, but each chosen with care, each meant to help her navigate her darkened world. One morning, as Brooks set out their breakfast of cornbread and preserves, Isla reached for his hand. "Might we say grace?" she asked softly. He stiffened, memories of Sarah's morning prayers catching in his throat. But Ayla's face held such gentle hope that he found himself nodding. "Reckon we might." "Dear Lord," she began, her voice warm in the quiet cabin, "we thank you for this food, for shelter from the storm, and for the kindness of strangers who become friends. Bless this meal and those who share it. Amen." Simple words, like his own had become, but they stirred something long dormant in Brooks's chest. "Amen," he echoed, surprised by how natural it felt. After that, grace became part of their routine. Brooks found himself watching Ayla's face during these moments, seeing how prayer smoothed the worry from her brow. Sometimes, when she thought he wasn't listening, she'd pray while doing the dishes or making the bed. Quiet conversations with God that made him wonder about his own long silence toward heaven. He began changing how he spoke, not just choosing clearer words but softening his tone. The gruff edge that had served him well in years of solitude seemed too harsh now, like wearing trail boots to a social dance. "Water's getting low," he said one morning, pulling on his heavy coat. "Need to break ice at the creek." "Could I come?" Ayla asked, turning toward his voice. "I haven't felt fresh air in days." Brooks studied her face, seeing the yearning there. "Storm's broken for now. Might do you good." He pulled out his spare coat, the one that still smelled faintly of pine sap and Sarah's lavender soap. "Here, it'll be cold." The coat engulfed Ayla's slight frame, but she clutched it gratefully. Brooks led her carefully down the cabin steps, one hand steady at her elbow. The snow crunched beneath their boots, and Ayla's face lifted toward the sound. "Everything sounds so crisp," she marveled, "like the air itself is made of crystal." Brooks looked around at the white-draped forest. Sun's out, making the snow sparkle fit to blind you. He winced at his poor choice of words, but Ayla just smiled. "Tell me what you see." He cleared his throat, unused to painting pictures with words. "Well, sun's hitting the pine boughs, making the snow slip off in clumps. Sky's so blue it hurts to look at. Couple of chickadees fighting over berries in that mountain ash yonder." "I can hear them," Ayla said softly, "and smell the pine." She reached out one mittened hand, catching a clump of snow as it fell. "It feels alive. Everything feels alive." Brooks watched as she turned her face upward, letting the weak winter sunlight play across her features. A tear traced down her cheek, freezing halfway. "You all right?" he asked, worry roughening his voice. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'm crying, but they're good tears. I thought, when I lost my sight, that I'd never feel sunlight again. But here it is, warming my face like God's own hand." Something caught in Brooks's throat. He remembered Sarah saying something similar near the end, about feeling God's presence in the sunlight through their cabin window. He'd blocked out those memories, too painful to touch, but now they rose up gentle as morning mist. "Thank you," Ayla said, squeezing his arm, "for bringing me out here, for helping me see in new ways." They stood there a moment longer, sharing the silence and sun, before Brooks led them carefully to the creek. The ice broke with sharp cracks under his axe, while Ayla held the bucket, her head cocked to track his movements by sound. That evening, as shadows lengthened across the cabin floor, Brooks pulled out the last of his dried apple pie, a treat he usually hoarded for himself. "Thought we might share this," he said, setting it on the table. Ayla's face brightened. "I smell apples and cinnamon." "Sarah's recipe," he found himself saying. "She'd dry the apples all summer, save them for winter nights when spirits needed lifting." "She sounds like a wise woman." Ayla's hands found the pie plate carefully. "Would you show me how to pour the coffee without spilling? I've been wanting to learn." Brooks moved closer, guiding her hands to the coffee pot. "Listen for the sound," he instructed. "It changes pitch as the cup fills." He helped her lift the pot, both of them intent on the liquid's musical note as it rose in the cup. "There!" Ayla exclaimed as she finished pouring without a drop spilled. "Did I do it right?" "Perfect as Sunday service," Brooks said, and was rewarded with her laugh, bright and clear as creek water. They sat together, sharing pie and coffee, trading stories of their lives before. Brooks found himself telling her about his trapping days, about the seasons of solitude that had once seemed like peace, but now felt more like hiding. "Sometimes," Ayla said thoughtfully, brushing pie crumbs from her fingers, "what we think is protecting us is really just keeping us from healing." Brooks looked at her sharply, but her face held no judgment, only understanding. She'd lost as much as he had, more in some ways, but hadn't let it wall her off from life or faith. "Reckon you might be right about that," he said slowly. Outside, snow began falling again, but its silence felt different now. Less like isolation, and more like a blanket drawn close around shared warmth. Brooks watched Ayla navigate surely to the wash basin with their empty plates, her steps confident now where they'd once been hesitant. She'd learned to see without eyes, he realized. Maybe it was time he learned to trust without fear. The evening passed in comfortable quiet, broken only by the pop of the fire and Ayla's soft humming. Brooks found himself grateful for the storm that had brought her to his door, even as his heart ached for her losses. In helping her find her way through darkness, he was finding his own path back to light. As night settled over the cabin, the snow continued its steady fall, but inside, two souls found themselves a little less alone, a little more whole than they had been before. The morning dawned crisp and clear, the storm finally breaking after days of steady snowfall. Brooks stood at the cabin door, adjusting his coat and watching his breath cloud in the early light. Behind him, Ayla moved with growing confidence through the cabin's familiar space, gathering kindling near the hearth. "You're certain you'll be all right?" he asked, not for the first time. "Town's a fair piece away." Ayla smiled in his direction, her hands steady as she stacked the wood. "I've learned my way around well enough. 20 steps from door to stove, 12 to the water barrel, 8 to the bed." She patted the axe handle propped nearby. "And I can split kindling by sound now, thanks to your teaching." Brooks nodded, then remembered she couldn't see it. "Got enough firewood split to last the day, but there's more stacked against the north wall if needed." He paused, watching her sure movements. "Don't try fetching any yourself, mind. Just tend what's here." "I'll be fine, Brooks," she said softly. "The Lord's watched over me this far. One day alone won't change that." Something in her quiet faith made his throat tight. He cleared it roughly. "Should be back before sundown. Got the list of supplies in my head. Flour, coffee, salt pork, maybe some of that peppermint candy you favor." Her face brightened at that last item, and Brooks felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with his heavy coat. With a final glance at Ayla's capable hands feeding kindling into the stove, he stepped out into the morning. His horse nickered a greeting as he approached the lean-to shelter. "Ready for a run, old friend?" Brooks murmured, giving the gelding's neck a pat. The horse had been restless during the long storm, and Brooks could feel the eager energy in its movements as he tightened the cinch. The ride down to Silver Ridge took longer than usual, the trail still treacherous with patches of ice hidden under fresh snow. Brooks kept a steady hand on the reins, his thoughts drifting between the supplies they needed and the woman he'd left alone in his cabin. Strange how quickly her presence had become familiar, how empty the trail felt without her quiet, observations about bird songs or the changing smell of the wind. Silver Ridge came into view just as the sun reached its peak, a scattered collection of wooden buildings strung along the valley floor like beads on a crooked string. Smoke rose from chimneys, and Brooks could hear the distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer even before he reached the first buildings. He tied his horse outside Mason's general store, stamping snow from his boots before pushing through the door. The bell's jingle announced his arrival, and old Mason looked up from where he stood near the pot-bellied stove, holding a piece of paper and surrounded by several townsmen. "Well, if it ain't the mountain man himself," Mason called out. "Thought maybe the storm had buried you up there." Brooks nodded in greeting, moving toward the counter with his mental list of supplies. But something in the men's expressions made him pause. They had that look folks get when they're chewing over particularly juicy news. "What's got everyone gathered up?" he asked, trying to sound casual as he began selecting items from the shelves. Mason waved the paper he was holding. "Got us a notice from some fancy lawyer out of Denver. Seems they're reopening investigation into some old land claims hereabouts." He adjusted his spectacles, peering at the document. Something about the Hartley claim, specifically. Remember that mess from a few years back? Brooks's hands froze on a sack of flour. "Hartley?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "James Hartley," one of the other men supplied. "That smooth-talking fellow who tried filing claims all over the territory before they caught him selling the same plots twice over. Died before they could bring him to trial, if I recall right." Mason nodded, still studying the notice. "Says here his widow might have knowledge pertinent to the investigation. They're looking to question any surviving family about the extent of the fraud." He glanced up at Brooks. Didn't know he had a widow still living. Brooks turned away, pretending to examine a shelf of canned goods while his mind raced. The Hartley claim. He knew exactly which piece of land they meant. It bordered his own property to the south, a prime stretch of valley that the railway had been eyeing for years. "Notice says something else interesting," Mason continued, unaware of Brooks's tension. "Seems if they prove the original claim was fraudulent, they'll be reviewing all connecting properties for proper documentation." He looked around at his audience. Could mean trouble for folks whose boundaries touch those disputed acres. The implications hit Brooks like a physical blow. His own claim to the ridge had always been somewhat informal, common enough in the early days of settlement, but potentially disastrous now that the railway was pushing through. If they started examining property lines. He forced himself to complete his shopping with steady hands, adding items to his pile while his thoughts churned. Mason kept reading bits of the notice to his rapt audience, but Brooks barely heard him over the pounding of his own heart. "Heading back up already?" Mason asked, as Brooks paid for his supplies. "Storm might not be done with us yet." "Best get moving while the trail's clear," Brooks replied, gathering his purchases. He paused at the door. "That notice mention when this lawyer's due to arrive?" "Week or so, weather permitting." Mason folded the paper carefully. "Suppose you'll want to have your own documentation ready, being as your place borders that Hartley claim and all." Brooks didn't respond, just nodded and stepped out into the afternoon light. His hands shook slightly as he secured the supplies to his saddle. All these years of peaceful solitude on his mountain, and now it could all come crashing down because of a dead man's schemes. The ride back seemed twice as long, every step of his horse bringing him closer to the choice he knew he had to make. Isla needed to know about the notice, about the investigation that could upend both their lives. But telling her meant watching that new confidence in her face crumple under the weight of her late husband's sins. Meant possibly seeing her withdraw into shame and fear, just when she was starting to find her footing again. The sun was dropping toward the western peaks by the time he caught sight of smoke rising from his cabin's chimney. Through the windows he could see the warm glow of the fire Ayla had tended all day. She'd managed just fine without him, just as she'd said she would. Brooks dismounted slowly, his joints stiff from the cold ride. Through the cabin's thin walls, he heard Ayla humming, that same hymn that had stirred his heart nights ago. The sound of it now felt like an accusation against his silence. He opened the door to find her sitting by the fire, her face turned toward his entrance with a welcoming smile. "I know those footsteps," she said warmly. "Did you find everything we needed?" Brooks set down his packages, watching her confident movements as she rose to help unpack. "Got it all," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "Found that peppermint candy you like, too." Her face lit up at that, and Brooks felt the weight of his secret settle more heavily in his chest. He should tell her now, before the lawyer arrived, before she had to hear it from strangers' lips. Should warn her that her name alone might cost them both their homes. But as he watched her carefully storing supplies, her fingers tracing the edges of shelves she'd memorized, pride evident in every sure movement, the words stuck in his throat. "Something wrong?" she asked, picking up on his silence. "You seem troubled." Brooks forced himself to breathe normally. "Just tired from the ride," he said, and felt each word like a stone in his mouth. "Weather's turning again. Might have more snow by morning." Ayla nodded, accepting his explanation without question. That trust, hard won, over their days together, now felt like a blade in his heart. She deserved the truth, deserved to know what was coming, but he couldn't bear to be the one to shatter her peace, not yet. Not tonight. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the promise of another storm. Inside, Brooks Pike stood in his warm cabin, watching a blind woman stack supplies with careful hands, and felt the weight of protection and honesty war in his chest like two wolves fighting over the same bone. The mountain winds whistled through the pine trees as evening settled over the cabin. Inside, warmth from the cook stove filled the small space with the rich aroma of rabbit stew. Isla stood at the wooden counter, her fingers finding the edge of the bowl with practiced ease as she ladled portions for their supper. She'd learned the layout of Brooks's cabin so well now that she moved with surprising grace, rarely bumping into furniture anymore. But something felt off tonight. Brooks had barely spoken since his return from town. His usual quiet nature turned into something heavier, more troubled. She could hear it in his footsteps as he moved about the cabin, slower, hesitant, as if carrying an invisible weight. "Supper's ready," she called softly, carefully carrying the bowls to the table. She'd counted the steps 100 times, 15 from counter to table, with the rough patch in the floorboard at step 12, warning her she was nearly there. Brooks's chair scraped against the floor as he sat. "Smells good," he said, but his voice lacked its usual warmth. They ate in silence for a few minutes, broken only by the clink of spoons against bowls. Isla listened to Brooks's breathing, to the way he shifted in his chair. Something was definitely weighing on him. "You rode hard today for a man who just went to buy salt and beans," she said finally, keeping her tone gentle. She turned her face toward where she knew he sat, wishing she could see his expression. "I could hear it in your horse's breathing when you returned." Brooks's spoon stopped moving. "Had to outrun the weather," he mumbled, but the excuse sounded hollow, even to his own ears. "Was there trouble in town?" She tilted her head, listening intently. "I heard wolves howling last night. Perhaps they're coming down from the high country?" "Wolves. Yes, that's—" Brooks cleared his throat. "That's what folks were talking about. Might need to check the sheep pens more often." Ayla set down her spoon and reached across the table. It took a moment, but her fingers found his rough hand where it rested beside his bowl. She felt him tense at her touch, but didn't pull away. "I trust you, Brooks Pike," she said simply. "Whatever burden you're carrying, you don't have to shoulder it alone." The silence that followed felt heavy with unspoken words. Brooks's hand trembled slightly beneath hers before he gently withdrew it, pushing back from the table. "Best check the firewood," he said, his voice gruff. "Night's turning, cold." Ayla listened to him stride to the door, his footsteps somehow more uncertain than usual. The door opened and closed, letting in a brief gust of mountain air that stirred her hair. She sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, and prayed for whatever troubled her rescuer's heart. When Brooks returned, his boots heavy with snow, she had already cleared the table and was sitting in her usual spot by the fire. Her worn Bible lay in her lap, the one possession she'd had with her when Brooks found her by the creek. "Would you read?" she asked softly. "My father always said scripture sounds sweetest in the evening hours." There was a long pause, then the creak of Brooks's chair as he settled beside her. She held out the Bible, and his calloused fingers brushed hers as he took it. The leather binding crackled as he opened it, pages rustling as he searched for a passage. "The 27th Psalm," he said finally, his voice rough. "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear?" His voice caught on the word light, and Ayla heard him swallow hard before continuing. "The Lord is the strength of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid?" As Brooks read on, his voice grew steadier, though something raw remained in its depths. Ayla listened, her hands folded in her lap, feeling the familiar words wrap around her like a warm blanket. She remembered reading these very verses in brighter days before the darkness came. Now they held new meaning, speaking of a different kind of sight. "Wait on the Lord," Brooks finished, his voice barely above a whisper. "Be of good courage, and he shall strengthen thine heart. Wait, I say, on the Lord." The silence that followed felt sacred somehow. Ayla heard Brooks close the Bible carefully, but he didn't move to return it. Instead, he sat still, his breathing uneven in the quiet room. "Thank you," she said softly. "It's been too long since I heard those words properly spoken." Brooks cleared his throat. "Been too long since I spoke them," he admitted. "My wife, she used to read the good book every evening. Haven't touched it since she passed." Ayla nodded, understanding flowing between them. "Sometimes the words find us when we need them most," she said, "even if we've tried to forget them." Brooks stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Getting late," he said, his voice tight with emotion. "You should rest. I'll bank the fire." Ayla rose carefully, one hand finding the familiar wall to guide her to her bed. Brooks's bed, really, though he'd insisted she take it while he slept on his bedroll near the fire. She listened as he moved about the cabin, his footsteps heavy with whatever burden he carried. Later, after Ayla's breathing had settled into the rhythm of sleep, Brooks stepped outside into the crystal-clear night. Stars blazed overhead in the mountain sky, their cold light painting the snow-covered ground in silver. He walked a few paces from the cabin, his boots crunching in, the fresh powder. The weight of his secret pressed down on him like a physical thing. He looked up at the vast expanse of stars, feeling smaller than ever beneath their ancient light. For the first time in years, words of prayer formed in his mind, halting and uncertain. "Lord," he whispered into the cold air, his breath forming clouds in the starlight. "I don't know what's right anymore. Protecting her seems kind, but lying feels like poison in my gut." The mountain winds whispered through the pines, offering no clear answer. Brooks stood there for a long time, wrestling with his conscience. Isla's trust in him felt like a precious thing, fragile as the teacup she'd knocked over, valuable as the faith she carried so quietly. He thought of her sitting at his table, offering her hand without hesitation. Thought of her gentle words. "I trust you, Brooks Pike." The memory twisted in his chest like a knife. Finally, as the cold began seeping through his coat, Brooks made his decision. He would tell her the truth about the lawyer's notice and her husband's troubled legacy. She deserved to know what might be coming, deserved the chance to prepare herself. But not tonight. Not when she'd just found her footing in this new darkness. Not when the piece of scripture still lingered in the cabin's warm air. Tomorrow, perhaps, or the next day, when he found the right words, the right moment. Brooks turned back toward the cabin, his decision sitting uneasily in his chest. Through the window he could see the dying glow of the fire he'd banked for the night. Somewhere in that warm darkness, Isla slept, trusting in his protection. "Lord, help me," he whispered once more to the stars. Then he stepped back inside, closing the door quietly behind him. The cabin settled into night's stillness, but sleep was long in coming for Brooks Pike. He lay on his bedroll, listening to Ayla's steady breathing from the other side of the room, and felt the weight of tomorrow's truth pressing down like storm clouds gathering over the mountain. The wind began its assault at midnight, howling through the mountain passes like a wounded beast. It rattled the cabin's shutters and sent loose snow swirling in ghostly patterns past the frosted windows. Brooks Pike lay awake on his bedroll, listening to the storm's fury and wondering if the roof would hold. Morning brought no relief. The wind only grew stronger, driving fresh snow against the cabin walls in stinging sheets. Brooks added extra logs to the fire, trying to ward off the creeping cold that seemed to seep through every crack. "Sounds fierce out there," Ayla said from her place near the hearth. Her fingers moved steadily over the rough wool blanket in her lap, searching for worn spots to mend. "Like all the mountain spirits are having themselves a terrible argument." Brooks managed a grunt of agreement as he checked their food stores. The sight made his stomach tighten. Their supplies were running lower than he'd like. He'd meant to do more hunting before the weather turned, but recent events had distracted him. "Might need to stretch what we've got," he said, measuring out cornmeal for the morning's porridge. "Storm could last a while." "Then we'll stretch it," Ayla replied simply. She set aside her mending and stood carefully, one hand trailing along the wall for guidance. "Let me help with the grinding. 4 hands work better than 2. Brooks started to protest, but something in her steady expression stopped him. Since losing her sight, Ayla had learned to navigate the cabin's confines with growing confidence. Her determination to contribute, to not be a burden, struck a chord in him he couldn't quite name. They worked together at the grinding stone, Ayla's smaller hands steady on the handle, while Brooks added kernels. The familiar motion seemed to soothe her. He noticed how her shoulders relaxed, how the worry lines around her unseeing eyes softened. "My mother taught me to grind corn when I was just a girl," she said over the stone's rough song. "Said a woman who knows how to make meal will never go hungry." A small smile touched her lips. Though I expect she never imagined I'd be doing it blind in a mountain cabin during a storm. The wind howled particularly fierce just then, making the cabin's timbers creak. Brooks glanced up at the ceiling, frowning at a suspicious dark spot forming in one corner. "Roof's starting to leak," he muttered, more to himself than Ayla. "Thought I'd patched it proper before winter set in." Ayla's hands stilled on the grinding stone. "Can you fix it in this weather?" "Have to try. Can't have water coming in with temperatures dropping." He stood, joints protesting the movement. "You stay by the fire. I'll see what I can do." But Ayla was already rising, brushing meal dust from her skirts. "I can help," she said firmly. "Just tell me what you need." Brooks looked at her incredulously. "It's dangerous enough with two good eyes. You can't—" "I can pass you nails and hold things steady," she interrupted. "I won't let you risk your neck alone on that roof in this wind." Her chin lifted slightly, that stubborn tilt he'd come to recognize. "Besides, the cold will be less bitter if we work together." Something caught in Brooks's throat at her words. This blind woman with her quiet strength and unflagging spirit. She continued to surprise him, to humble him. "All right," he said gruffly. "But you follow my instructions exact, you hear?" They gathered what they needed: boards, nails, tools, and old canvas for patches. Brooks helped Ayla into his spare coat, wrapping it tight around her against the bitter cold. Then they climbed carefully to the cabin's low roof through the small attic hatch. The wind hit them like a physical blow, trying to tear them from their precarious perch. Brooks anchored himself firmly, then guided Ayla to a protected spot where she could brace herself against the chimney. "Hand me those nails." "When I call for them," he shouted over the wind's roar, "and sing something so I know you're still there." So Ayla sang as Brooks worked, her clear voice carrying hymns of comfort through the storm. She passed nails with steady hands whenever he asked, never complaining about the cold that numbed their fingers or the snow that found its way down their collars. It took nearly 2 hours to patch the worst of the leaks. By the time they climbed back inside, they were both shaking with cold and exhaustion. But there was triumph in it, too. They'd faced the storm together and won this small victory. Brooks built up the fire while Ayla made coffee, moving around the cabin with the confidence of familiarity. They sat close to the hearth, letting warmth seep back into their bones as the wind continued its assault outside. "Thank you," Brooks said quietly, watching steam rise from his cup. "For helping. For not letting me do it alone." Ayla wrapped her hands around her own cup, letting its warmth seep into her cold fingers. "That's what neighbors do, isn't it? Help each other through the storms?" The word neighbors struck Brooks oddly. Was that what they were? This arrangement had started as emergency shelter, but somewhere along the way, it had become something else. Something he wasn't quite ready to name. The storm raged for 3 days straight, keeping them confined to the cabin's 4 walls. They fell into a routine, sharing the work of survival, stretching their meals, finding ways to pass the long hours. Brooks watched Ayla patch worn blankets with careful stitches, her fingers finding tears by touch alone. Her quiet industry shamed his own restlessness. On the 3rd night, as they sat by the fire after a meager supper, Ayla broke their comfortable silence with words that made Brooks's heart stutter. "I've been thinking about Thomas lately," she said softly. "My husband, about the choices he made that brought us west." Brooks set down his coffee cup carefully, trying to still the sudden trembling in his hands. "Oh?" "He wasn't always a greedy man," Ayla continued, her face turned toward the fire she couldn't see. "When we first married, he had such dreams, honest dreams of building something real. But the gold fever got into his blood, like it did so many others." She sighed deeply. He started making deals, trading claims he had no right to sell, borrowing money he couldn't repay. Brooks sat very still, hardly daring to breathe. This was the conversation he'd both dreaded and needed to hear. "I suspected, of course," Ayla went on. "A wife knows when her husband's path starts turning crooked. But I told myself it would work out somehow, that God would show him the right way again." Her hands twisted in her lap. "Instead, the fever took him before his schemes could catch up to us. At least that's what I thought at the time." The fire popped and sparked, throwing shadows on the cabin walls. Brooks stared into the flames, his throat tight with unspoken words. "I've carried such shame," Ayla whispered, "for not speaking up when I should have, for not being brave enough to face the truth of what he was doing." She turned her face toward Brooks, and though her eyes couldn't see him, he felt pierced by her directness. "That's why I'm telling you now, because you've shown me such kindness, and you deserve to know the kind of woman you've taken into your home." Brooks's chest ached with the weight of his own secret. Here was Ayla, laying bare her soul, while he still held back the truth that could destroy what little peace she'd found. The lawyer's notice in town, the threat to both their lands, she deserved to know it all. But looking at her face in the firelight, seeing the cost of this confession in the tension around her mouth, he couldn't bring himself to add to her burden. Not tonight. Not when she'd just shown such trust in sharing her pain. "We all carry things we ain't proud of," he said finally, his voice rough. "The past is the past." But sleep eluded him that night as he lay on his bedroll, staring at the glowing coals in the fireplace. The wind had finally begun to die down outside, but the storm in his heart raged on. Ayla's soft breathing came steady from the bed across the room, the sound he'd grown accustomed to these past weeks, the sound that somehow made his lonely cabin feel like home again. He feared losing that peace, feared the look that would come into her unseeing eyes when she learned the full truth, that her husband's schemes still cast shadows over their future, that the very land beneath them might be pulled out from under their feet. The coals pulsed with dying light, like the beating of a troubled heart. Brooks watched them fade to ash, feeling every second draw them closer to the moment when truth could no longer be held back. When this fragile peace they'd found would be tested by the consequences of old sins and present choices. Dawn would come soon enough. For now he listened to Ayla's breathing and prayed for wisdom he wasn't sure he deserved. A week of warmer days had begun melting the deep mountain snow. Brooks spent long hours clearing fallen trees and ice from the steep trail that led down to Silver Ridge, his axe ringing through the crisp morning air. Each evening, he returned to the cabin exhausted, covered in snow and pine sap, dreading the conversation he knew couldn't be delayed much longer. Ayla sensed his growing tension. She'd learned to read his moods in the weight of his footsteps, the length of his silences. When he finally spoke one evening over their simple supper of beans and cornbread, she wasn't surprised by his words, only that he'd finally found the courage to say them. "Got to take you to town tomorrow," Brooks said, his spoon scraping against his bowl. "Can't put it off no more." Ayla set down her own spoon carefully. "Because of Thomas's land claim?" The bowl clattered as Brooks nearly dropped it. "How did you—" "I may be blind, but I'm not deaf," she said softly. "You've been carrying something heavy since your last trip to town, and I've had plenty of time to think about what it might be." She folded her hands in her lap. "Thomas left more troubles behind than just unpaid debts, didn't he?" Brooks exhaled slowly. "There's a lawyer come through, examining old claims. Your husband's name, It's stirred up trouble. Could affect my land too, being adjacent." He paused, struggling with the words. "I should have told you sooner." "Yes, you should have." There was no accusation in her voice, only quiet certainty. "But I understand why you didn't." She turned her face toward him, and though her eyes couldn't see him, their directness still made him shift uncomfortably. "We'll go tomorrow. I won't hide from the truth, whatever it may be." Dawn broke clear and cold the next morning. Brooks helped Isla onto his sturdy mule, wrapping her in his warmest blankets. He'd rigged a small sled to drag behind them, loaded with supplies they might need for the journey. The trail down to Silver Ridge would take most of the day, even with his week of clearing. As they set out, Ayla sat straight-backed in the saddle, her face tilted up to catch the weak winter sun. Brooks led the mule on foot, picking their way carefully down the snowy path. The morning was quiet, except for the crunch of their passage and the occasional cry of a winter bird. "The air smells different today," Ayla said after they'd been traveling for an hour. "Sweeter somehow." Brooks paused, testing the air himself. "We're passing through a stand of young pines. They give off a different scent than the old growth higher up." Ayla smiled. "I'm learning to read the mountain through my nose, like you read tracks with your eyes." She cocked her head, listening. "And that sound? Water running under ice?" "Creek's starting to thaw," Brooks confirmed, impressed by her growing awareness. "You're getting good at this." "I have to be," she said simply. "The Lord took my sight but left me my other senses. Seems ungrateful not to use them." They continued down the trail, Brooks calling out warnings for rough spots or sharp turns. Ayla learned to anticipate the mule's movements, adjusting her balance with growing confidence. When they stopped to rest at midday, she insisted on helping prepare their simple meal of dried meat and hard bread. "You don't have to prove anything," Brooks said, watching her carefully slice cheese with sure fingers. "I'm not proving, I'm preparing," she replied. "Whatever happens in town, I need to show them I'm not helpless. That blindness hasn't made me less than I was." Brooks thought about the stares they would face in Silver Ridge, the mountain man and the blind woman walking into town together. Folks would talk, speculate, judge. But watching Ayla's quiet competence as she packed away their meal, he knew she was right. Let them stare. Let them see what courage looked like. The afternoon brought warmer temperatures that made the snow treacherous. Brooks led the mule with extra care, acutely aware of his precious cargo. Ayla kept them both entertained by sharing stories from her childhood in Missouri, her voice steady, even when the trail grew rough. "Tell me what you see," she requested as the sun began to sink. "Help me picture where we are." Brooks cleared his throat, unused to such detailed description. "Valley's opening up below us now. Town's about 2 miles ahead, mostly hidden by that last ridge. Sun's setting behind it, turning the snow all pink and orange. Couple of hawks circling overhead, probably looking for evening prey. And the buildings? Are they like I remember?" Main Street's still just one long row of false fronts. Sheriff's office, general store, saloon, all looking a mite shabby after the hard winter. But there's smoke coming from most chimneys, and I can see lights starting to come on. Ayla nodded, building the picture in her mind. "I used to wash clothes for half those businesses. Funny how life changes so quick. One minute you're planning your future, the next." She trailed off, then squared her shoulders. "Well, no use dwelling on what's past. The Lord has a purpose in everything." The sun was nearly gone when they finally reached the outskirts of Silver Ridge. Brooks helped Ayla down from the mule, making sure she was steady on her feet before offering his arm. She took it without hesitation, her grip firm and sure. The main street was busy with early evening traffic, miners coming off shift, women heading home from late shopping, children running last errands before supper. The bustle died down as people noticed the unlikely pair making their way toward the boarding house. Whispers followed in their wake. "Ain't that the Hartley widow? Thought she died in that mine blast. What's she doing with Pike? Lord above, she's blind as a cave bat." Brooks felt Ayla's grip tighten slightly on his arm, but she kept her head high, her steps steady. As they passed the general store, she leaned close to whisper, "They'll see what faith looks like before this is through." The simple words struck Brooks deep. Here was a woman who had lost everything, her sight, her livelihood, her reputation, yet she walked through judgment with grace, armed with nothing but trust in God's purpose. His own fears about losing his land seemed smaller somehow, measured against her quiet courage. Mrs. Henderson, the boarding house owner, met them at the door with surprised recognition. "Why, Ms. Hartley, we all thought, that is, we heard." She fumbled for words, then gathered herself. "Well, you're looking peaked, dear. Come in out of the cold. I've got stew on the stove and plenty of room." Brooks helped Ayla up the steps, watching carefully as she counted them under her breath. At the door, she turned back toward the street, as if sensing the eyes still fixed on them. "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson," she said clearly, her voice carrying to the small crowd that had gathered. "It's good to be back among neighbors. I expect there's quite a bit of explaining to be done, on all sides." A few of the onlookers had the grace to look ashamed at their earlier whispers. Others simply stared harder, already planning how they'd spread the news of the blind woman's return. But Ayla paid them no mind, allowing Brooks to guide her inside with the same dignity she'd shown all day. In the warmth of the boarding house parlor, Mrs. Henderson fussed over them both, insisting they eat before discussing any business. Brooks watched as Ayla navigated her bowl of stew with practiced care, thanking their hostess with genuine warmth. She showed no sign of the exhaustion she must have felt after their long journey, no hint of fear about what tomorrow might bring. Later, as they settled into their separate rooms for the night, Brooks found himself standing at his window, staring out at the dark street below. He thought about Ayla's words, about seeing what faith looks like. Maybe that's what he'd been watching all day. Faith walking steady through uncertainty, faith holding its head high in the face of judgment, faith believing in purpose even when the path ahead looked dark. He had come down this mountain carrying guilt about hiding the truth, fear about losing his land. But Ayla had shown him something different, something about facing truth head-on, about finding strength in surrender to God's will. Whatever tomorrow brought, he knew they would face it together, guided by her unwavering light. Through his window he could see the moon rising over the ridge where his cabin sat, where he'd found her in the snow what seemed like a lifetime ago. So much had changed since then. Or maybe, he reflected, it wasn't change so much as awakening. To truth, to faith, to possibilities he'd forgotten existed. From the next room, he heard Ayla's clear voice lifted in evening prayer, carrying the same hymn she'd sung that first night in his cabin. The familiar melody drifted through the thin walls, a reminder that some things remained constant even when everything else shifted like spring snow in the mountains. The morning sun cast long shadows across Silver Ridge's muddy main street as Brooks and Ayla made their way to the church meeting house. The white clapboard building stood stark against the mountain backdrop, its weathered cross reaching toward the pale winter sky. Brooks felt Ayla's hand tighten on his arm as they approached the steps. "Quite a crowd gathered," he murmured, noting the number of townsfolk filing into the building. "I can hear them," Ayla replied softly. "Their boots on the wooden steps, their whispers." She paused, taking a deep breath. "The Lord gives us strength when we need it most." Inside, The meeting house hummed with contained energy. The council members, prominent men of Silver Ridge, sat at a long table facing the congregation. Pastor Matthews, a stern-faced man with graying temples, occupied the center chair. Brooks recognized the traveling lawyer who'd posted the notice, his city clothes marking him as an outsider. As they walked down the center aisle, conversations hushed. Brooks guided Ayla to the simple wooden chair placed before the council. He started to step back, but she kept hold of his sleeve. "Stay close," she whispered. "Please." He remained standing beside her, a silent guardian. The morning light streaming through the windows caught the scars on her face, testament to the explosion that had taken her sight. Yet she sat straight-backed, her hands folded calmly in her lap. Pastor Matthews cleared his throat. "Mrs. Hartley, you've been called before this council regarding certain irregularities in your late husband's land claims. Mr. Peterson here represents the railway company's interests." He gestured to the lawyer, who shuffled his papers importantly. "We have documents suggesting Mr. Hartley filed multiple claims using different names," Peterson began, his voice carrying across the hushed room. "The railway company requires clear title before proceeding with construction plans. If fraud is proven, both your claim and the adjacent Pike property revert to railway control." A murmur ran through the congregation. Brooks felt his jaw tighten, but Ayla's voice cut through the whispers with surprising clarity. "I appreciate the council gathering to hear truth spoken plain," she said. "My husband, James Hartley, was not an honest man. That's God's truth, though it pains me to say it." The room fell silent. Even Peterson stopped shuffling his papers. "When we came west, James carried dreams bigger than his conscience could hold. He saw the railway coming and thought to profit from it. Yes, he filed false claims, not just here, but in 3 other territories." Ayla's voice remained steady, though her hands twisted in her lap. "I learned of it too late to stop him. The fever took him before he could make it right." "You admit to knowing of this fraud?" Peterson pressed, leaning forward. "I admit to learning of it, yes. But knowledge isn't the same as participation, Mr. Peterson. The Lord knows I carried shame for my husband's sins long enough. But shame belongs to the deed, not to the truth-telling." Brooks watched Pastor Matthews shift uncomfortably in his chair. The pastor had turned Ayla away when she'd first sought help after James's death, assuming she'd been part of the fraud. "The truth," Ayla continued, her voice growing stronger, "belongs to God, not to men with papers. I can't give you back what James took. I can't undo his wrongs. But I can stand here and speak honest words, trusting that the Lord sees deeper than any of us." She turned her face toward the congregation, though she couldn't see them. "I lost my sight in that mind blast, but maybe that was God's mercy, because now I see clearer than ever that we're all just people, trying to make our way home. Some take crooked paths, some straight, but in the end, we answer to something higher than railway companies or land offices." A sob broke the silence. Pastor Matthews had pulled out his handkerchief, wiping his eyes without shame. "Mrs. Hartley," he said, voice thick with emotion, "I owe you an apology. When you came to me, I judged without mercy. I failed to see the truth in your heart." "We all failed her," someone called from the congregation. "Left her for dead up there in the mountains. And look how she comes back, speaking God's honest truth when she could have kept quiet." Suddenly, someone started clapping. The sound spread like wildfire through the meeting house, building to a thunderous applause. Brooks squeezed Ayla's hand, not caring who saw. Her fingers trembled in his, but her face shone with quiet joy. The lawyer, Peterson, tried to restore order. "This is all very moving, but it doesn't resolve the legal." "Oh, sit down, Peterson," one of the council members interrupted. "Can't you see there's something more important happening here?" Pastor Matthews stood, raising his hands for quiet. When the applause died down, he spoke with authority. "The council will take Mrs. Hartley's testimony under advisement, but I think I speak for all when I say her courage today has shown us what true faith looks like." He turned to Ayla. "Whatever legal tangles need straightening, you've done right by God and man both. We'll not see you harmed for speaking truth." The meeting dissolved into informal gathering, with townspeople coming forward to welcome Ayla home. Women who'd once whispered behind her back now pressed her hands warmly. Men who'd avoided her offered gruff apologies. Through it all, Brooks stayed at her side, watching in wonder as walls of judgment crumbled before simple honesty. As the crowd thinned, Pastor Matthews approached them. "Mrs. Hartley, Ayla, would you and Mr. Pike join me at the parsonage? Martha's got coffee on, and I believe we have some planning to do." The parsonage sat behind the church, a modest home warmed by Martha Matthews's careful keeping. The pastor's wife settled them in the front parlor with steaming cups of coffee, while snow began falling outside, soft and steady. "Now then," Pastor Matthews said, once they were comfortable, "about that ridge property." "Sir," Brooks began, but the pastor waved him quiet. "The railway can't take land without proper compensation. That's law. But more than that, they can't take what's already been put to good use. A working homestead, for instance, with a man and wife making improvements." Brooks felt his heart skip. He looked at Ayla, who sat very still, her face turned toward the pastor's voice. "Of course," Matthews continued, "there'd need to be proper documentation. A marriage license, perhaps. And the community's support wouldn't hurt." "Are you suggesting—" Brooks started. "I'm suggesting nothing, Mr. Pike. I'm merely pointing out possibilities." The pastor's eyes twinkled. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, doesn't he? Sometimes he uses blindness to help us see, and loss to help us find what's truly valuable." Martha brought more coffee, and they sat talking as the snow fell thicker outside. They spoke of improvements needed on the ridge, of building a proper cabin, of making something new from the ashes of the past. Ayla's hand found Brooks again, and this time, neither let go. The lamplight cast warm shadows across the parsonage walls as they planned and dreamed. Outside, the snow continued its gentle descent, covering Silver Ridge in a blanket of white. Not an ending, but a clean beginning, soft and relentless as hope itself. Through the window, Brooks watched the flakes swirl in the gathering dusk. He thought of his lonely cabin on the ridge, of how Ayla had filled it with song and prayer. He thought of her courage today, speaking truth when lies might have been easier. Mostly, he thought about God's mysterious ways, how sometimes you had to lose everything to find what you were meant to have all along. The dawn broke with an unnatural roar. Ayla stirred from her sleep in the parsonage guest room, her heart quickening at the sound. Years of mountain living had taught her the difference between ordinary wind and something more ominous. This was no common storm. "Like a freight train," she heard someone say outside her window. Boots pounded on the wooden walkway, and voices called through the howling wind. Martha Matthews burst into the room, her usually composed voice tight with worry. "Ayla, dear, you need to hear this. There's been another collapse at the mine." Ayla's hands clutched her blanket. "Another blast?" "No, the storm. The weight of the snow. Part of the main shaft gave way. There are men trapped below." The words hit Ayla like ice water. She remembered the darkness, the choking dust, the terror of being left behind. No one deserved that fate. Heavy footsteps approached her door, Brooks's familiar tread, but urgent now. "They're calling for volunteers," he said from the doorway. "Anyone who can dig. Pastors organizing rescue teams." Ayla pushed herself up, reaching for her shawl. "When do we leave?" We don't. Brooks's voice was gentle but firm. I'm going. You're staying here with Martha. No. The word came out sharp, desperate. Ayla stood, finding her way to him by sound alone. Her fingers found his coat, already cold from the outside air. Please, Brooks. The mountain's already taken so much. Don't let it take you too. He caught her hands in his, rough palms warming her fingers. Those men have wives waiting, children hoping. If I can bring even one man home, I'll go. His voice softened. You taught me that, Ayla, about serving something bigger than ourselves. Tears burned behind her useless eyes. She felt him lean down, his breath warm against her forehead as he pressed a kiss there. Keep faith, he whispered. I'll come back to you. Then he was gone, his footsteps fading into the storm's fury. Martha's arm slipped around Ayla's shoulders, steadying her as she swayed. Come, Martha said. We'll pray by the fire. It's all we can do now. The hours crawled by like wounded things. Ayla knelt on the hearth rug, letting the fire's warmth remind her of Brooks's cabin, of quiet evenings spent learning to trust again. She prayed without ceasing, her lips moving silently over familiar psalms and desperate pleadings. Martha kept coffee brewing and soup warming on the stove. Every few hours, exhausted men would stumble in for warmth before returning to the rescue effort. Ayla learned to recognize them by their breathing, the wet, ragged sound of lungs filled with mine dust and cold mountain air. Any word? She would ask each time, but the answers were always the same. They'd cleared another section, found another pocket of air, but the shaft was treacherous. Support beams groaned under the weight of snow and sodden earth above. Night fell, though Ayla knew it only by the change in activity outside. The rescue continued by lamplight, men calling to each other through the darkness. She dozed fitfully in Martha's rocking chair, waking at every new voice, every opening door. Dawn brought no relief. The wind still howled, and Brooks had not returned. Pastor Matthews came home briefly, his voice hoarse from shouting directions. They're still digging, he told them. Found 3 men alive in a side tunnel. Brooks, he's leading a team deeper in. Says he knows the old shaft layout from his prospecting days. Ayla's heart clenched. Of course Brooks would go deepest, risk most. It was who he was, the man who'd carried a stranger from certain death, who'd opened his home and his heart when it would have been easier to ride past. The second day blurred into the third. More survivors emerged, but with them came darker news. Support beams were failing faster than they could be replaced. The mountain itself seemed to be shifting, settling under its burden of snow. Through it all, Ayla prayed. She taught Martha the hymns Brooks had come to love, and they sang them together while their men faced the darkness below. Other wives joined them, filling the parsonage with harmony born of hope and fear. On the 4th day, the first rescue team withdrew completely. The men who returned spoke in hushed voices of corridors collapsed behind them, of paths sealed by tons of rock and timber. "The whole mountain's coming down," Ayla heard one man say. "Can't risk any more lives." "But there are still men down there," another protested. "Not anymore. Not after that last cave-in." Ayla pressed her hands to her ears, refusing to hear more. Brooks was alive. He had to be. He knew the mountains better than anyone, knew every twist and turn of those old shafts. He would find a way out. The 5th day dawned in silence. The wind had finally died, leaving behind a world muffled in snow. Rescue teams returned one by one, defeated. Women wept in the church, while men spoke in subdued tones of recovery rather than rescue. But Ayla would not give up. Each evening, she made her way carefully back to Brooks's cabin, guided by Martha or one of the other women. She lit the lamp in the window, just as she had when waiting for his return from hunting trips. She sang the hymns that had first opened his heart, letting her voice carry across the snow-buried ridge. "He's gone, child," Martha said gently after a week had passed. "The Lord called him home." But Ayla shook her head, her faith unshaken. "The Lord led him to me once before, when everyone thought I was lost. He'll lead him back again." She kept her vigil as the days lengthened. The lamp burned every dusk, its light a beacon in the darkness. Her hymns echoed through the valley, carried on the winter wind. Some called it madness, this blind woman's stubborn hope. But others remembered how Brooks had once found her, following a limping horse through snow much like this. The ridge grew silent as winter tightened its grip. Trails disappeared under deep drifts, and wolves howled closer to town than usual. Still, Ayla maintained her routine. Each morning, she prayed. Each evening, she lit the lamp and sang into the void. "Faith isn't faith until it's all you have left," she told Martha one particularly cold night. "And even in the darkest mine shaft, God's light still shines." She thought of Brooks, of his quiet strength and growing tenderness. She remembered how he'd taught her to navigate by sound and touch, how his voice had softened when reading scripture. Most of all, she remembered his last words to her. "Keep faith." And so she did, holding on to hope with the same stubborn courage that had helped her survive her own darkness. The lamp burned on, a small light against the vast mountain night, while Ayla's voice lifted in song, not in mourning, but in certainty that somewhere, somehow, Brooks would find his way back to her. "The Lord is my light and my salvation," she sang into the darkness. "Whom shall I fear?" The wind carried her words across the snow-covered ridge, up into the mountains where mines lay silent and deep, where paths disappeared and reappeared with each new storm. She sang for the lost, for the found, for the man who had taught her that even the deepest wounds could heal. Most of all, she sang for Brooks, believing that somehow her voice would lead him home. The first morning alone, Ayla woke reaching for Brooks's familiar presence, finding only cold air and silence. She lay still, listening to the cabin's emptiness. No coffee brewing on the stove, no heavy boots crossing worn floorboards. Just the winds moaned through pine boughs and her own measured breathing. She pushed herself up, determination straightening her spine. Brooks had taught her well these past weeks, how to navigate the cabin's layout, how to tend the fire, how to survive. Now she would put those lessons to use. 12 steps to the stove, her hands outstretched. The metal was cool beneath her fingers. She felt for the kindling box, counting out strips of bark and small twigs by touch. The match scraped loud in the quiet room. Heat bloomed against her face as the fire caught. "Lord," she whispered, feeding larger pieces of wood into the growing warmth. "Watch over him in the darkness below." She measured her days by practical rhythms. Each morning she added 3 pieces of wood to the stove. At midday, 2 more. Evening required 4 to keep the cabin warm through the night. The woodpile beside the stove shrank steadily, marking time's passage like grains in an hourglass. The water barrel needed filling twice daily. She made the journey carefully, dragging her feet through snow to memorize the path from door to creek. The bucket's weight threatened her balance, but she persevered, knowing Brooks would worry if she let herself grow weak. 12 steps down the path, she murmured. Turn at the big rock, 15 more to the creek. The water's song guided her, growing louder as she approached. Its icy bite stung her hands as she dipped the bucket, but she welcomed the sensation. It meant she was still fighting, still hoping. Cooking proved more challenging. She'd burned her fingers twice already, learning to judge the stove's heat without sight. But Brooks had organized his stores well. flour in the square tin, coffee beans in the round one, dried meat hanging on strings she could easily reach. She made simple meals, grateful now for the hours they'd spent with him teaching her the cabin's geography. The hardest times came at night. Coyotes prowled closer than usual, their yips and howls echoing off the ridge. She kept the rifle loaded beside her bed, though she knew she couldn't aim it. The weapon's solid presence comforted her anyway, a piece of Brooks's protection, even in his absence. One evening, reaching to trim the lantern's wick, she singed her palm against the hot glass. The pain brought tears, but she didn't cry out. Instead, she wrapped her hand in a cool cloth and kept the flame burning bright. It was her beacon for Brooks, marking home through the mountain dark. She wouldn't let it die, no matter the cost. A week passed this way, marked by dwindling candle stubs and shrinking woodpiles. Ayla developed a rhythm to her solitude. Prayer, work, more prayer. She sang hymns while she cooked, letting faith fill the cabin's corners where loneliness lurked. Sometimes she imagined she heard Brooks humming along, his deep voice harmonizing as it had on their last peaceful evening together. The messenger's arrival broke her routine. His horse's hooves crunched through crud-topped snow, an unfamiliar rhythm that set her heart racing. She stood in the doorway, gripping the frame, as boots scraped on the porch. "Mrs. Hartley?" The voice was young, uncertain. "I'm Timothy Wells, from the pastor's house. I've brought word about Mr. Pike." Ayla's fingers tightened on the doorframe. "Come in, Mr. Wells. There's coffee hot on the stove." She heard him stamp snow from his boots, then the rustle of paper being withdrawn from a coat. "The pastor wrote it all down, ma'am. Would you like me to read it?" "Please." She sank into Brooks's chair, bracing herself. Timothy cleared his throat. "Dear Sister Ayla, I write with news both miraculous and grievous. Through God's grace and Brooks Pike's courage, 20 men were saved from the mine's depths. Brooks led them through old tunnels he remembered from his prospecting days, finding paths where others saw only walls." Ayla pressed her hands together, holding on to each word as Timothy continued reading. "He went back one final time, saying he heard voices calling. The support beams were groaning, fit to split, but he wouldn't leave while hope remained. The cave-in came minutes later. We've searched where we could, but the shaft is sealed tight as a tomb. No body has been found." Tears slid down Ayla's cheeks, but her voice remained steady. "He saved 20 men?" "Yes, ma'am. Fathers, sons, husbands, brought them all out alive. The whole town's calling it a miracle." "Then one more miracle isn't too much to ask." She wiped her eyes with her apron. "The Lord's not finished yet." Timothy shifted uncomfortably. "Pastor Matthews sent me with his wagon, Mrs. Hartley. Says you shouldn't be up here alone, especially not being, well, with your condition. He's offered you a room in town until spring." Ayla shook her head. "Thank you, but no. This is where Brooks will look for me when he comes home." "Ma'am," Timothy's voice was gentle. "The miners who survived, they say that last cave-in, nobody could have—" "If the Lord saved those 20 men," Ayla interrupted softly, "he can bring one more home. Please tell Pastor Matthews I'm grateful for his concern, but my place is here." She heard Timothy sigh, then the scrape of his chair as he stood. "At least let me bring you more supplies before I go. Your wood's getting low." "Much obliged," she smiled in his direction. "Would you stack it by the door? I can manage from there." While Timothy worked, Ayla folded the pastor's letter carefully, tucking it into her Bible. 20 men saved. 20 families spared grief's bitter cup. The number echoed in her mind like a prayer. "The wagon offer stands," Timothy said as he prepared to leave. "Anytime you change your mind, just ring the church bell. Someone will come." "The Lord will provide what I need," Ayla answered. She stood in the doorway until his horse's hoofbeats faded, then felt her way to the stove. The coffee had grown cold, but she drank it anyway, letting its bitterness remind her of Brooks's morning ritual. That evening, she lit the lantern earlier than usual. Its glow warmed the window glass beneath her fingers as she began to sing. Her voice carried clear and strong across the snowy ridge, a hymn of praise for 20 lives saved and a plea for one more miracle. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound," she sang into the gathering dark, "that saved a wretch like me." The words filled the cabin, spilling out into the winter night. She sang for the rescued miners, for their grateful families, for the men who'd risked everything in the search. Most of all, she sang for Brooks, believing that somewhere in the mountain's vast silence, he might hear and find his way back to her. The candle burned lower, but Ayla kept singing. Her faith had grown stronger in this week alone, tempered like steel in fire. She would keep her vigil, tend her flame, and trust in God's timing. Brooks had taught her to navigate darkness by sound and touch. Now she would teach him to follow her voice home. When the last note faded, she added wood to the stove, counting the pieces by touch. 3 logs left in the box, tomorrow's morning warmth. Beyond that, the fresh supply Timothy had stacked, enough to keep hope burning one day at a time. "Thank you, Lord," she whispered, "for 20 miracles, and thank you in advance for one more." She made her way to bed, each step sure despite the darkness. The coyotes began their nightly chorus, but their cries no longer frightened her. She had found her own kind of strength in this solitude, not the fierce independence she'd once prized, but something deeper. A faith that could light the way home, even through the darkest night. The lantern's glow filled the cabin with gentle warmth, a beacon against the mountain's vastness. Ayla lay in her narrow bed, listening to the wind's whispers and the cabin's familiar creaks. Somewhere out there, she believed, Brooks was finding his way back to her. Until then, she would keep his home warm, his light burning, and her faith strong. "Come home," she murmured into the quiet. "I'll be waiting." The night deepened around the cabin, stars wheeling unseen above the snow-covered ridge. Inside, the lantern burned steady and bright, its flame reflecting off the window glass, a single point of light in the darkness, guiding the way home. The storm descended without warning, a howling beast that shook the cabin's bones. Ayla huddled closer to the hearth, feeding precious logs into its hungry mouth. The roof timbers groaned overhead like a ship at sea, and she pulled Brooks's old wool blanket tighter around her shoulders. "You should see this storm, Brooks," she spoke into the darkness, her voice barely audible above the wind. "Though I reckon you'd say I'm hearing it just fine." A weak smile touched her lips as she remembered his patient lessons. "Listen to the pine boughs," she mimicked his deep tone. "They'll tell you when weather's turning." Her fingers found a piece of kindling, and she ran them along its length, checking for splinters just as he'd taught her. "Split with the grain," she murmured, "never against it." The wind screamed louder, and memories flooded back. Brooks guiding her, hands on the axe handle, teaching her to feel the wood's heart. His quiet pride when she'd split her first log alone. The way he'd cleared his throat to hide his emotion. "I'm keeping your home warm," she told the empty room, "just like you showed me." Sleep came in fitful waves, and in her dreams, Brooks's voice carried through the storm. "Ayla," it called, sometimes near, sometimes far. "Ayla, hold on." She reached for him in the darkness, but found only cold air. When gray dawn finally came, seeping through the cabin's windows, the storm had spent its fury. Ayla wrapped herself in Brooks's coat and stepped onto the porch, snow crunching beneath her boots. The mountain air lay still and heavy with silence. Yet something stirred in her heart, a warmth that had nothing to do with the coat or the lingering fire. It bloomed in her chest like spring sunshine, a certainty beyond reason or sight. Brooks was alive. She felt it as surely as she felt the rough porch rail beneath her fingers or the morning frost on her cheeks. "Thank you, Lord," she whispered, tears freezing on her face. "Thank you for this peace." She turned back inside, determination straightening her spine. The fire needed tending, and she had wood to split. She would keep his home ready, warmed by flame and faith, until that peace became promise fulfilled. Easter morning crept over the mountains with hesitant light, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of pearl gray. Inside Brooks's cabin, Ayla knelt beside her bed, hands clasped in prayer. The dawn air bit cold through her shawl, but she barely noticed, lost in her morning devotions. "Lord," she whispered, "on this morning of your victory, I—" A scraping sound from outside cut through her words. She lifted her head, listening intently. The noise came again, a dragging, shuffling sound on the wooden porch steps. Her heart quickened, but she steadied herself. Probably just wind-pushing debris across the boards. "Hello?" she called out, rising slowly to her feet. "Is someone there?" Then she heard it. A voice so weak it might have been imagination, carried on the frozen morning air. "Ayla." Her hands trembled as she felt her way to the door. The voice came again, closer now, rough with exhaustion but unmistakable. "Brooks?" She yanked the door open, guided by the sound of labored breathing. "Brooks!" A heavy weight fell against her, nearly knocking her backwards. The familiar smell of pine and leather filled her senses as Brooks collapsed into her arms. His clothes were stiff with ice, his skin cold as stone where it touched her neck. "I heard you," he rasped, his fingers clutching weakly at a torn piece of coat. "Your hymns, every night, followed your voice, led me home." Tears streamed down Ayla's face as she helped him inside. "Thank you, Lord," she cried out. "Oh, thank you." Her practiced movements found blankets, wrapped them around his shivering form as she helped him toward the fire. Just then, a shaft of sunlight broke through the clouds outside, streaming through the window to warm them both. Brooks's freezing hand found hers, squeezing weakly but surely. "You kept singing," he whispered, never stopped believing. "God never stopped believing in you either," she answered softly, holding him close as the Easter morning light grew stronger, blessing their reunion with its golden touch. The spring thaw crept into the mountains day by day, melting snow into rivulets that sang down the slopes. Inside the cabin, Ayla tended Brooks with gentle determination. His hands, blackened by frostbite, needed constant care. She wrapped them in clean cloths soaked with pine tar and herbs, working by touch while he slept fitfully in his chair by the fire. "You don't have to fuss so much," Brooks would say, but she could hear the smile in his voice even through his pain. "Hush now," she'd answer, carefully changing the bandages. "The Lord didn't bring you back just so you could be stubborn." As his strength returned, visitors began making their way up the mountain trail. They brought baskets of fresh bread, jars of preserves, and thick wool blankets. Each time the cabin door creaked open, Ayla would smell wood smoke on their clothes and hear the shuffle of boots being stomped clean. "Never seen such kindness," Brooks muttered one afternoon, watching yet another neighbor depart. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," Ayla replied, sorting through the day's gifts by touch. When the lawyer rode up from Silver Ridge, Brooks insisted on meeting him alone on the porch. Ayla listened through the open window as papers rustled in the spring breeze. "Draw it up proper," Brooks said firmly. "The ridge, the cabin, all of it goes to Miss Hartley." "Brooks, no," Ayla protested, hurrying to the door. "I won't take your home from you." He caught her hand in his bandaged one. "You gave me sight again, Ayla. Real sight, the kind that matters. This ridge is yours now." Even the pastor made the journey up, his horse's hooves crunching on the last patches of snow. He stood in their tiny cabin, hat in hand, and asked permission to hold a service of thanksgiving. "We'll call it Mercy Ridge," he said warmly, "for what the Lord has done here." Ayla felt Brooks squeeze her hand as she nodded. Yes, tears of joy slipping down her cheeks. Through her blindness, she had never seen more clearly. God's grace shining bright as sunlight on new snow. Late spring painted the mountains in soft greens and wild violets. The morning air carried sweetness from blooming wild roses as townspeople made their way up the winding trail to Brooks and Ayla's cabin. Children who had once whispered fearfully about the mountain man now scattered flower petals along the path, their laughter echoing across the ridge. Near the cabin, miners and widows from Silver Ridge worked together, setting up wooden benches in neat rows. Above them, a simple arch of fresh-cut pine boughs stretched toward the blue Colorado sky, fragrant sap still beading on the bark. Brooks stood beneath the arch, tugging at his borrowed suit collar. His hands, still bearing the marks of frostbite, trembled slightly as he watched Ayla approach. She walked slowly but surely, one hand on the pastor's arm, wearing a cream-colored dress borrowed from the milliner's wife. Her unseeing eyes shone with joy. "Who gives this woman?" the pastor asked, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd. "We all do," came the united response from the townspeople, bringing tears to Ayla's eyes. The couple knelt together on a quilt spread before the arch. The pastor raised his hands over them, speaking words of blessing that drifted out across the valley. Brooks's rough voice shook as he spoke his vows, but grew stronger with each word. When Ayla spoke hers, her clear voice rang with certainty. "Love healed me more than any doctor could have done," Brooks whispered as he slipped a simple gold band onto her finger. After the ceremony, the community gathered to help dedicate the cabin's new purpose. A freshly carved wooden sign was mounted above the door, its letters deep and true. Mercy Ridge, sight through faith. The cabin would now serve as a shelter for travelers and the blind, a beacon of hope in the wilderness. As evening approached, lanterns were lit around the yard. The gathered community shared a feast spread across long tables, their fellowship as warm as the spring sunshine. Children who once feared the mountain man now sat at his feet, begging for stories. Miners who had survived the cave-in raised their cups in thanks. Widows who had known Ayla's struggles embraced her with understanding hearts. On Mercy Ridge, two outcasts had found not just each other, but a greater purpose, becoming a light of hope for all who would follow. Autumn painted the San Juan Mountains in brilliant strokes of gold and crimson. The aspens shimmered like coins catching sunlight, their leaves dancing in the cool mountain breeze. From the wooden porch of the cabin on Mercy Ridge, Ayla stood with her face tilted toward the warmth of the afternoon sun. Below, the familiar sounds of wagon wheels and horse hooves echoed up the trail. The shelter had become a beacon of hope for weary travelers and those seeking refuge. The cheerful voices of children mixed with the steady rhythm of work as another family made their way to the cabin's welcoming doors. Ayla's fingers traced the smooth wooden railing, weathered by rain and sun. She smiled, remembering how many hands had touched this same spot. Lost souls who had found their way here, guided by God's grace and the stories of healing that now spread through the territory. The floorboards creaked behind her, and she knew Brooks's footsteps without turning. His arm slipped around her shoulders, strong and sure, drawing her close. The scent of pine sap and leather that always clung to him wrapped around her like a familiar blanket. "3 more wagons coming up from my Silver Ridge," he said softly, his voice gentler than it had been in those first days after finding her by the creek. "Thompson family's bringing supplies for winter." Ayla leaned into his embrace, feeling the steady rise and fall of his chest. "When I lost my eyes," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I thought God had left me alone in the darkness." She turned her face toward him, though she couldn't see his features. "But he was just waiting for me to see with my heart instead of my eyes." Brooks's arm tightened around her, and she felt him nod. Together they bowed their heads in quiet prayer, thanking God for his mercy and guidance. The autumn sun warmed their faces as they stood in peaceful silence. A meadowlark trilled from the cabin's eaves, its sweet song carrying across the ridge. The breeze rustled through the changing leaves, carrying with it the promise of winter, but also the certainty of spring's return. The ridge glowed under heaven's light, bathed in the golden hues of sunset. From this high place, where 2 broken souls had found healing in each other's faith and love, God's grace seemed as vast as the Colorado sky itself, endless, encompassing, and ever-present, even in the darkest night. Through blindness, loneliness, and loss, faith had led them home. On Mercy Ridge, they had found not just sight, but vision, not just shelter, but sanctuary, not just hope, but healing. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.